it's about to explode now, but that's not all.
On June 20th, something terrible began in Crimea. A new wave of explosions on the peninsula. Tarkhanku, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Now, out of 12 missiles, some were heading toward the bridges. What you're seeing now is exactly that. There's still no outbreak.
The security service of Ukraine is launching a new phase of special operations. They are attacking the Crimean bridge, military facilities, airfields, and military bases. Panic and evacuation have begun in Crimea.
We've been standing here since 4 a.m. for 25 minutes. Around 5 o'clock, they turned us around here and sent everyone home to rest. We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan right now. There it is again, all day long, all depot. A new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkhanku, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. Evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad. The headquarters of the Northern Fleet, Northern nuclear submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, the Kerch Bridge. A great start to the Crimean summer. The bridge is damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports is damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft, these are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out, 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count Ukraine. At least one already confirmed, 295 was hit at Ukrainka. So strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge is real. It has strategic significance because it connects Taman, the Russian side, connects with our peninsula, Crimea, and if it is put out of commission, destroyed basically until we liberate Crimea, or let's say until a bomber can approach and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it can't be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. There only engineering methods can be used to destroy it, meaning blowing up all the pillars. So you have to bring it down. But there are a lot of problems with that, at the very least, with deactivating it from its active state. But simply, for example, to damage it at this point as it was damaged before, security services and in 2022 and 2023, it was possible to take it out of operation and keep it that way for a certain period, at least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign. That is actually possible, especially since the strike specifically on the Kerch Bridge is tied to the start of our liberation campaign for the deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because without question, the bridge must be destroyed first. Either destroy it, damage it, or disable it. There are different ways, but perhaps to put it out of commission. This is so that the Russians cannot transfer enough forces to Crimea afterward using long-range strike capability. With the same drones and missiles, yes. There are 200, 300 kilometers from Crimea. Almost all of our equipment can fly that far, so yes, that is basically the maximum range of our strike capabilities, the long-range operational level ones, which are also handled by the security service. That's why I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are more than 100. At least 100 stationary ones are currently operational, and about 100 mobile ones as well. So the work of the special services lies ahead. There is an enormous amount of work to be done, as they say. But you could say that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea. Roman Yegorovich regarding the nuclear triad. I heard a comment from Keith Kellogg is simply stunned. He believes this is just an enormous, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. Ukraine has struck at two components of the Russian Federation's nuclear triad. This refers to the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course to the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation? That means there will be a third one as well. If, for example, a Russian submarine gets hit, I wouldn't be surprised, whether it's in the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet, because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. We've already struck both Russian ground positions and Russian strategic positions. Only one component remains, the so-called naval component. So in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather, if you didn't notice, they've gone quiet somewhere. The main intelligence directorate. They carried out an operation in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet. They've gone quiet somewhere, and it's not out of the question that yet another Russian submarine might sink. Putin, as always, will say, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It drowned. What happened to the aerospace aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke up into quark, so that could happen too. Let's wait. There's probably still a third serious blow ahead. But this is the first one. You were right to point out the issue of the triad. Emphasize that properly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. Specifically, strategic bombers. This is strategic. Russia's nuclear arsenal. Malyuk's strike demonstrated that this component no longer dominates the world. Definitely. Why? Because a 500 drone or a sufficient number of drones can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. It's possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that the era of drones has already begun. The era of drones. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into something like that. The planet Sheleziaka, no water, no vegetation, no minerals, inhabited by robots. That is, it's inhabited by these very drones. And in the end, this apocalypse could, of course, become a reality. The one that at one time was shown in Hollywood movies. In other words, all of this problem really exists in all countries of the world that have invested in strategic security mechanism. Well, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over 100 years into something that in the end a 500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds, as Malyuk demonstrated? So I would put it this way. Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become central at the start of a new era in security provision. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, well, obviously, drones that can perform for a small investment, for a small amount of funding, accomplish big tasks. All these strategies will eventually be destroyed. Once, if anyone remembers, Raikini, yes, may he rest in peace, once said he had a good monologue. There was one where those 6-story fools, the dinosaurs, where are they now? Extinct. But the bedbug, it's been living and thriving for 3 billion or however many years. That's about how it is now. The next era will be something along those lines. So the bedbugs we're talking about now, that is the small drones, they will get smaller, but they won't lose any combat power. And eventually, what will they reach? They'll reach what Putin recently predicted, together with Skabeva and all the rest of the Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing and laughing about combat mosquitoes. But believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes swarm into Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, up to the Urals, I'm telling you, not a single Russian will be left there. They'll be drawn by the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong. Oh boy, there won't be, not a single filter can help. You have to put on gas masks if you're anywhere near Russia or a Russian Federation citizen. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd. All this Russian Federation herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to conduct a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just a bit over 1,000 kilometers. And in principle, we've already carried out missions there. Olenia is not far from the base, right? So this direction is in principle possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. But as for Vladivostok, in some ways, that's even easier. Have you ever discussed with you what Vladivostok actually is? Well, it's Zelený Klin. It's the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians genetically, for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, for example, I know this from the airfields Chernihivka and also Ukraine Katis are, well, our people from Poltava and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge, our Ukrainian one. Yes, Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, especially if in the end we recognize the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan about returning those so-called disputed islands, which are actually Japanese islands. And Sakhalin is a Japanese island too. So this issue needs to be resolved right there. And at the same time, of course, we should put pressure on the Pacific Fleet because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think our midshipmen aren't there? Practically every other one there has Ukrainian, well, our deep-rooted family trees among the midshipmen. Because back in the day, in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians and all the midshipmen in the Navy were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when I spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars a realistic target for the special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, the strategic missile forces. That means there's a certain selection process for service there. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there's very strict control over this component. And it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. While knowing that they're all butterfingers, they'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent missile. It was first launched, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main foundational, so to speak, basic starting conditions, of course, go back to the Soviet Union, where there was a strong tradition, a good rocket engineering school, especially after our Ukrainian practically bet everything on the rocket program, if you remember. That is, as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev fulfilled this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the rocket field, of course, was very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up scattered across different republics, the main ones, by the way, are here with us in Ukraine. After all, we were the ones who built the SS-18, the so-called Satan, at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol missile, Topol is a successor in this kind of missile program, especially the Topol M, which is quite a good missile. The next one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but a very similar missile, just with a different warhead on with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, and that's the Yars. So Topol, then Yars, RS-24, then RS-26, they built or tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as Rubesh. That's the Rubesh, but Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. But the Sarmat can't even get off the launch pad. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. most likely this whole series of missiles is finished. In other words, they won't really have the Sarmat and they'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. When it's informational, well, let's say pressure and so at least becomes possible to ignore, people will forget about it too. But there are two missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, about 6 warheads, each with its own guidance system that are deployed. So this is truly a serious problem. It's probably not as much of a problem for us because these are nuclear weapons and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And as for firing a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at themselves, well, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well. The Chinese, in other words, these are long-range destruction mechanisms. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders, the Iskander KN-23s, and also the Kinzhal missile that is both ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, which need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on something. Diesel, gasoline, they fly on aviation, kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. So this is a problem because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have set up serious production of these missiles, but so far they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that in the end we will get more own ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. That's why, first of all, we need to destroy all Russian hydrocarbon facilities, refineries, and everything related to production.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
For fuel, and secondly, of course, air defense. That is to increase the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot and SAM-T. There is no third option.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the Security Service of Ukraine has carried out a successful special operation. Then bridges near Melitopol were blown up. These are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, it is meant to sustain the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation? Last night there were explosions, and today, during the day, the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
They have packed Crimea like sardines in a can with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand, basically. They've increased the livestock count of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they've also crammed in military facilities there for almost 11, well, it's practically the 12th year now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was stationed there. We allowed it well, mainly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end they lost Crimea. From the very start in 2014, they allowed the loss of Crimea. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders, they are indeed civilian invaders now, of the conventions apply to them, none at all, though they don't know this. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader. And none of the conventions that protect civilians apply to them. That is, naturally, for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them, in principle, is not that difficult, specifically in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is an enclosed area, squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only 2 entry and exit points from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes toward Melitopol, passing through Henichescos are the routes, those branches. That's why for us, when it comes to liberating Ukraine, it's important to start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself if you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbas, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply asking to be the very first, to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, the first thing, of course, is to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there: the railway bridge, the automobile bridge, the energy bridge, the fuel bridge, and the water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch Bridge, the entire Kerch Bridge system. And it is absolutely necessary to destroy all of them, all 5 of these bridges in this sense. The second bridge, which is next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks and, of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge of this general group is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left. The Russians can use them to transport a fairly large amount of weaponry, significant tonnage. Then there is the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields, which can be targeted, and basically the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the land bridge, the so-called land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches of both highways and railways running through there. That's why, of course, these routes can and should be targeted, starting from Rostov and Taganrog, then through the Meuse, and then across the bridges over the Kalmius. But in reality, for us, it's very close, just 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. So in principle, that's probably what we'll continue to do. That's why these strikes, which happen simultaneously both on the Kerch Bridge and on the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely against the railway junctions. This is exactly the same kind of operation. First, you cut off the supply systems, and then you hit them with long-range strike assets, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones once a week for Crimea. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component, and the milestone for the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used to strike military targets in Crimea, and only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to move in there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of air units to support a ground operation. In the meantime, of course, we'll keep harassing Crimea relentlessly.
So the summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be a hot one.
Exactly right. And the Russians really need to remember, like we talked about back in 2023, they need to learn how to swim, because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. So whether it's freestyle, breaststroke, or doggy paddle, the Russians will have to swim out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those routes simply won't exist.
Run away from Crimea while you still can. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I will continue discussing the SBU's web operation. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He said that these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, These attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli train operation as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans imagined themselves in that situation, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain agreements, if I'm not mistaken, New START, that specifically protected strategic strike assets under these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these aircraft had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellites. So it turns out that the Russians, just like the Americans, are required to park their planes in locations visible to the opposing side. But we're not the opposing side. No one told Maliuk that. He hasn't read that New START treaty. Naturally, he just went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking out one target. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their own bases. And their bases are wide open. No one's even bothered to secure them. If the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the Russian American strategic assets, there's nothing to stop them either. And if the Chinese get serious about it, especially things could get real, we can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. That's their problem. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike capabilities, like Drone 7, a simple dirt cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich. Today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have allowed us to destroy this entire nuclear triad, they are simply shocked, frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
That's exactly right. Well done to the person who saw it this way. All this war, someone who is close to military matters, that's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century. No one nowadays remembers the sling or the boomerang B, which I don't mean the missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears. Now, that is in the last century when missiles appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. That is what was in the last century is simply not needed now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same fleet that used to consume trillions of dollars. I mean, just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And here, it turns out, Maliuk, by making the decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, simply crossed out this almost century-long saga of essentially embezzling the largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service showed a real slap in the face to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead, when it explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear detonation or just a serious conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radionuclide glow that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades away quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yet, he would be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, they understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet about the nuclear topic now? Because they realized perfectly well that it wasn't for nothing that they poked a hole in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might end up falling out onto Grandpa Lenin? Maybe a third head will grow there and start running around saying, you're on the right path, comrades. Well, more or less in the direction they're being pointed.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information, that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash the commander of the Russian Air Force accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we have destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a conclusion.
Well, if this isn't an information psychological operation, and it could be a Russian one, they sometimes throw this kind of event into the information stream through certain dubious channels. And then if, for example, the other side picks it up, they present it as something negative. Then they show this Kobyliash, yes, and we'll go on to say how we are not handling this properly. So for now, at this moment, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, although strictly speaking, in terms of responsibility, well, Kobyliash should have been made to fly. As for who, so to speak, will make him fly, or has made him, or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we are talking about real responsibility, it was specifically Kobyliash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then later he'll have to fly. How could it be otherwise?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect, the well-known analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you again soon this week.
Goodbye.